Well, greetings and welcome back to our study on becoming God's people, where we are looking at the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy and kind of tracing the beginnings of the people of Israel and how that can be relevant for us today. This week we are in Exodus 19. The people of Israel have finally made it to the mountain that we call Mount Sinai. The people are told to consecrate themselves and make themselves ready for God's appearance and God's coming to them. Now, a few things that we need to recognize. Number one, we don't know where Mount Sinai is. We are told that it took roughly 3 months for the people to journey from Egypt to Sinai, but obviously it took them longer than it would take somebody just walking by themselves. Number two, they stopped and they kind of quarreled, and so we're given the impression that it was a longer journey than it needed to be. And number three is this idea of 3 months. We're not exactly sure because there's some real issues in translation and understanding exactly what is meant by this 3 month period, but it's likely it is a symbolic number that is meant to correspond to either 50 days or 70 days after Passover. There is an ancient Jewish tradition that the law was given 50 days after the Passover, and thus it corresponds to the Feast of Pentecost that will be celebrated later, or will be established later in the Pentateuch. But there is this possible correlation that what the scripture, what the text is trying to say is that 50 days after the people left Egypt, they arrived at Sinai, or it might be and that could be because where the timing and the way the wording is 50 days and not necessarily 3 months, which for us would be closer to 90 days, but it could be in the third month or at the start of the third month. In other words, it would have been only for us 60 or less than 60 days. It's also possible that this references 70 days, which could be again a symbolic number, 7 times 10, the fulfillment of a number of completion. In other words, they've had the complete amount of time in the wilderness to be prepared to come to Sinai. We're not sure which one of those, but obviously it's meant to be somewhat of a symbolic number. It's not merely a literal timestamp, simply because we know that there's not other literal timestamps in other stories. Like in chapter 18, we don't have a timestamp. There is one earlier in chapter 17 with Moses, but again, that could be a symbolic number and trying to show how quickly the Israelites turned on him. So we shouldn't read too much into this, but we should be able to see that the author is trying to tell us something more than simply dating the time frame. Possibly, yes, and possibly he's writing it in such a way that it's meant to take us beyond just the general time. I tend to think that it was probably roughly 3 months that the Israelites were in the wilderness, but that this number is written in such a way that it is meant to underline. I tend to think, I guess I'm following the old Jewish ideas here, but I tend to think it's more of 50 days after the Passover. Then they have this moment at the mountain where the law is given. But that's just me following the tradition. But I do think there is something to this number. Second, we should notice again that this is the Mount of Sinai. We don't know where it is, and they have been in the region of Sinai. Have they come up to the mountain prior to this? We don't know. We don't know how long they've been there at the mountainside. Is this a representation of they've been there for a month, since Moses was told to go to Horeb to get water, or did they just arrive here? We don't know. And partially we don't know how Horeb and Sinai relate to each other and how we should read those texts. But that is a real difficulty with trying to map the history. Obviously, it's not a difficulty for us mapping the theology of the passage, but trying to be exact about the history of the passage, it makes it difficult because we don't know when or where anything happened, not precisely. Now, that's kind of some background to just the when and where. That's verses 1 and 2 of this chapter. We come up on the mountain, and we have this relationship between what's going to happen in chapter 19. We have verbal links to later chapters 20 through 24. There are some verbal overlaps to show that what the people are doing to prepare themselves for the covenant is exactly what they should be doing or what they are doing in the covenant. So the people here are already, when they're offered the covenant, part of their preparation is acting in the way that is consistent with the covenant. We're going to get into this more later, but what God is offering the people on Sinai is a formalized treaty. We look at treaties today between nations. This is something similar. This is a formalized treaty. Here's how you're going to act. Here's how I'm going to act. But in some senses, this is what they are promising later is being set up here. Hey, we want to be allies. We want to work together here. We're going to start before the treaty is even established. So there's those links going forward, but there's also, for me, a significant thematic link going backwards. And that is to chapter 18. In chapter 18, Jethro comes to Moses and says, you need to create a system of judges. And the system of judges is meant to not simply judge cases the way we think of modern judges. This is more along the lines of community development. These chiefs are community representatives. They are not simply justices or judges in the way we think of that in a legal sense. These are individuals who are assigned groups of people. Notice they're in groups of tens, very small groups, who they are supposed to judge between, but they're also supposed to teach these people the instructions, the Torah, that Moses is going to give to the people here in the next chapters. This institution is not simply something to judge cases as we think of it. It is a system designed to have a series of, we would be more inclined to say, small group leaders who are keeping the peace and building community within Israel. This is more of a community development program than it is a legal structure. And here in chapter 19, when the people are consecrated, all of the language is royal priesthood language. The language is of kings and priests and how everybody in Israel is meant to participate in signs and observances that are usually reserved for kings and priests. And this points to the idea that the entire community, not just representatives, not just Moses and Aaron, not just the priests, not just the ruling body, everybody is supposed to be involved in building up and perpetuating this community environment. And so what we see is a continuation of the system that Jethro tells Moses to put in place. Put in place a system where the people are grouped together in small groups so that they can act as a holy people, building one another up and in community. Chapter 19, consecrate yourselves, every one of you, as if you are priests, the people who are supposed to be representatives between humanity and God. A priest is a person who is set apart to represent humanity before God and represent God to humanity. If everybody is doing that, in the entire community, then one of the major jobs of the priests is taken over by the entire community. And that is something that the Bible, it highlights this, but it's subtle. It's little things that aren't culturally apparent to us. But what the Bible is clearly saying here is that the priests are not simply in Israel, they're not simply the sole representative of humanity to God or God to humanity. They are a reminder to Israel of the people that they are supposed to be. They are not simply this elevated class in the same way that they are in every other society around them. They are a distinct reminder of the calling of the entire people and shine a light on who the people around them are supposed to be. In other words, when you look at a priest in Israel, you were supposed to see the person you were meant to be, at least in some ways, in some major ways. And so that is where we set up. Everybody is on this page coming into Sinai. Everybody is there ready to make the commitment. One last thing is that we notice the harsh detail that anybody who steps foot on the mountain is meant to be shot with arrows or stoned. This is because what they are doing is setting up a deliberate boundary and saying, this is God's territory. Do not invade it. Do not step over it. And the idea was that anybody who was inconsiderate enough to step over that boundary to God's side deserved a punishment of death, because that's just, it's foolhardy. It's thinking too much of yourself. Now, the problem is that person has stepped into territory that is more holy than humans are supposed to be. And so there's this weird overlap between this is the most unholy thing that you can do, and at the same time you are in the holy space. So what the punishment was death because of how unholy the person was, but because they had stepped into holy space, no other person was supposed to lay hands on them. This is a way of keeping distance from them, so that after they came off of the mountain, they were to be shot, so that nobody else was impacted by the sacred space that the guilty party had entered. I know it doesn't make sense to us. It's a little convoluted, and even with the explanation I've given, that's not the greatest, because you could feasibly go on for the entire length of this video to explain that little clause. So just kind of remember that I am saying this is a very brief explanation of something that is much more elaborate, that the boundary between sacred and non-sacred and normal space and sacred space is one that we have to be careful with, and that's what this passage is meant to remind us of. So with that, I'm going to close. I know it's kind of a downbeat to close, but hey, that happens sometimes. As always, if you have questions, comments, any feedback that you'd like to give to me, I'd appreciate it. I love when I hear from people about how this is helping them or how I can improve these videos. So until we meet again, God bless.